Alright, so this is a video about my first attempt at making a guitar neck from scratch, and we see here I'm starting by cutting out pieces for the multi-laminate neck, and that's going to be 3 pieces of maple and 2 pieces of purple heart. Now I'm cutting these pieces out in such a way that I can book match 2 matching pieces together, so 2 pieces of purple heart, 2 pieces of maple. And the reason for that is because when you do it that way, the grain from those pieces of wood will be going in opposite directions once they're glued into the neck. And doing that causes any tension from that piece of wood to work against itself, which makes the neck more stable and less likely to warp or twist. And so here I'm gluing up the neck in stages, mostly just so that they don't slip around and move as I'm gluing them. And here I'm flattening out the area that the fretboard is going to be glued to by running it over the jointer. That'll give me a nice flat square surface to work with. Now I'm using this piece of wood on the side as a router guide so that I can make the channel for the truss rod. Now what I'm doing here is just using my bandsaw to remove some of the excess material on the sides of the neck so that my router has a little bit less work to do later. I'm also beginning to work on the shape of the headstock. Now I've got my neck shape template attached to the neck using masking tape and super glue. It's quite effective, and I'm using a flush cutting router bit to finalize the shape of the neck itself. And then some more shaping of the headstock. Now I'm drilling an opening for access to the top of the truss rod. Now you can see I've got some marks laid out on this piece of ebony for the fret slots, and I'm just cutting this piece down a bit closer to its final size before I glue it in place. Now I'm cutting the fret slots using those marks that I just mentioned. Those marks were made with a knife so that the saw blade has something to follow. Here I'm putting a piece of masking tape over the top of the truss rod so that wood glue doesn't get into it while I'm attaching the fretboard. After that, I'm clamping the fretboard into place with the top end square to where the nut is going to be. This allows me to know that all the fret slots are square to where the nut is going to be, which is important. And then I'm drilling through some of those fret slots so that I can put in some locating pins so that once I am gluing the fretboard into place, I know that's exactly where I want it to be. Now that the glue is dry, I'm just going back to the bandsaw to remove some of the excess material of the fretboard so that again the router has a little bit less work to do once I get to that. Alright, so we've run into a slight problem with the fretboard. The way it's cut right now, the fret slots are not exactly where I want them to be. They got a little bit off track. So right now on the low E side, the scale length is about 1 millimeter shorter than I want, and on the high E side it's about 1 millimeter longer than I want. Now, because it's all pretty even throughout, this would still be playable just with a little adjustment of the bridge, but I'm just not satisfied with it the way it is right now. And the second problem with the fretboard is that it's much too thick right now. So what this means is I can sand away entirely the fret slots that I have cut already. So what that means is that I basically get a free mulligan on the fret slots. Alright, so now here I am cutting a second set of fret slots, and this one turned out much better, exactly where I wanted them to be. And now I'm using a radius block to sand in the radius of the fretboard. In this case I'm using a 10-inch radius block. Of course, after all of that sanding to put in the radius, I now have to recut the ends of the fret slots because they've been sanded away once again. And at this point, I'm using a drill press to remove some material to begin work on an inlay. And then, of course, I'm cutting out the inlay material as well as a front plate for the headstock. Making some very careful cuts here. Then using a drum sander to finalize the shape a little bit, and then a bit of a dry fit. So after gluing them in place, I'm just going back to the sanding blocks to sand the inlay flush with the fretboard. And now I'm also sanding down the thickness of the plate for the headstock because I don't want it to be too thick. And now gluing it in place. And of course sanding it flush to the shape of the headstock. Now I begin carving the final profile of the neck itself. I was using a Shinto saw rasp. And what I'm doing right now is just sanding down the thickness of it, leaving it flat for now, before moving on to this step where I'm carving in a series of facets. And then what I'm doing is making more and more facets with each pass until the neck is essentially round. I'm just finalizing the shape, and then I'm coming in with a round file to put in the volute and the shape at the heel of the neck. And then sanding it, of course. So here's a problem with the inlay. There's a bit of a void underneath that left wing because the inlay didn't go in perfectly square. It went in at a bit of an angle, so I needed to cut some of it away and then make a new piece to replace it. Now I'm just using a triangular file to prepare the fret slots for the frets, and then running the frets through this curving jig to get them to the correct radius to match the radius of the fretboard, and then hammering them into place. Then moving on to leveling, crowning, and polishing. At this point I have already done the ends of the frets, but I did that off camera because I wanted to concentrate on what I was doing. Here's the crowning. Still effectively crowning, just sanding the tops down a little bit and then polishing with some fret rubbers. So next I'm drilling some tuner holes, and I'm using a center point drill bit to follow the pilot holes I had made, and the way I'm working here is I'm drilling halfway through from the front and then coming in from the back to meet that original hole from the front, and doing it this way helps to prevent tear out on either side. I was working on preparing a truss rod cover, and also off camera I had changed my mind about how I wanted to do the truss rod cover and decided to recess a bit of that plate on the front of the headstock first. So now I'm noticing there's a bit of a problem with how thick the fretboard is still. I wanted to put a shim underneath the nut, and to make that shim I just used some of the off-cut ebony from the fretboard itself. And now I'm rough cutting some string slots in the nut before I glue it to the neck itself, and I'll be able to finalize these once the neck is attached to the body and I can get some strings in it to feel the action. And then gluing the nut into place with some super glue. So here I'm just drilling for some side dots. Then gluing those into place with a little bit more super glue and then snipping the excess. So once all the glue is dry, I'm going to use the flush cutters to snip away as much as possible before moving on to a file to get them down really close and then sanding it all smooth. Alright, so here we have the neck as finished as it's going to be for a little while, because I need to actually attach it to the body before I can apply any finish, and I also need it to be on the body so I can string it up and make sure the nut is fully filed to where it needs to be to set the action properly. As for the construction, it is a 5-piece multi-laminate neck, 3 pieces of maple, 2 pieces of purple heart. Then the fretboard is ebony. The plate on the headstock as well as the truss rod cover are Buckeye Burl, and so is the inlay. The fretboard is 24 frets. These are all just regular nickel-silver frets. And I'm pretty happy with how it turned out so far. The only thing that I'm not super happy with is how the inlay turned out. Which you could see from the video, there was just a void underneath this part of the inlay that, you know, I had to remove a whole large portion of this and replace it with a couple other pieces of wood. I think this inlay in particular, specifically the shape, is probably a little too ambitious for the first neck I've ever made. I wouldn't mind doing an inlay like this again, but I would probably simplify the design a bit first, just to make the whole thing a little bit easier to do. I also would not use Buckeye Burl for an inlay again. It was very obnoxious wood to work with because the grain is just going every imaginable direction, so carving it to fit small cavities like this is a real pain. Then the reason I use Buckeye Burl is because that's going to match what I used for the top on the body, which is not ready yet, and that's why I can't quite finish this neck yet. And that's going to be the end for this video. This was just on making the neck itself, but for a bit of a sneak peek on the body, which is partially underway, it looks something like this. And there are several voids in it that have been filled with resin, so it's been quite the interesting build so far. Can't wait to see it when it's done.